It didn't begin with a headline, it began with a silence. Behind the closed doors of a private royal office, Prince William reportedly uncovered a clause so quietly buried, so meticulously worded, that its implications could redraw the future of the monarchy. By the time aides realized what had been triggered, it was already too late. The Queen's trust had changed, and so had Camilla's place within it. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. What followed that moment was not chaos, not confrontation, but something far more unsettling: control. Reports suggest that in the days leading up to this discovery, a discreet review of documents tied to Queen Elizabeth II had already been underway, shielded from public view and even from certain senior aides. This was not a routine audit. It was described, in hushed internal tones, as a precision review, one that required absolute confidentiality and a carefully selected circle of legal minds. Those familiar with the inner workings of the palace whisper that William did not stumble upon this clause by accident. Rather, he was guided toward it through layers of archival records, correspondence, and legal frameworks that had not been revisited in years. At the center of it all was the Queen's trust, long regarded not merely as a financial instrument, but as a symbolic extension of royal continuity itself. A structure designed to protect legacy, safeguard influence, and ensure that the monarchy remained insulated from shifting personal loyalties. Yet buried within its framework, according to insiders, was something dormant, something waiting. And when William and his advisors finally reached that section, the atmosphere reportedly shifted in an instant. Conversations slowed. Notes were taken more carefully. Even seasoned legal experts, accustomed to the complexities of royal governance, were said to have paused. The clause itself, its wording precise, almost surgical, was allegedly tied to conditions of succession and influence. Not dramatic in tone, not explosive in language, but devastating in implication. It outlined a scenario in which certain roles within the trust could be reevaluated, adjusted, or even quietly removed if predefined conditions were met. And while no names were explicitly mentioned, the interpretation, according to multiple palace-adjacent sources, pointed in a direction that could not be ignored. Queen Camilla, once firmly positioned within the inner circle of influence, was suddenly being discussed in a different light. What made this moment even more extraordinary was the reaction it triggered behind the scenes. Staff who had long operated with routine confidence began to move with caution. Instructions were simplified, then restricted. Access to certain documents became limited, even for those who had previously handled them without question. Insiders claim that phrases like need-to-know basis and containment protocol began circulating quietly among aides, signaling that whatever had been uncovered was not meant to ripple outward, at least, not yet. And yet, despite these efforts, something subtle but undeniable began to leak into the atmosphere of the palace. A shift in tone, a tension that could not be fully concealed. Early whispers suggested that this was no coincidence, no accidental oversight buried in decades-old paperwork. It was, as some have described, a deliberate safeguard designed with foresight, waiting patiently for the precise moment when it would be needed most. But this wasn't just a technicality buried in legal text. It was a mechanism decades in the making, tied directly to the Queen's final vision for the crown. Long before the current crisis, Queen Elizabeth II was quietly building something far more enduring than public appearances, a legal architecture designed to outlive every scandal, every marriage, and every shifting alliance within the House of Windsor. What makes this moment so unsettling is not just what was discovered, but how far back it truly goes. Because according to those familiar with the inner workings of the monarchy, this was never about reacting to present tensions. It was about anticipating them. Decades ago, as the pressures of modern royal life began to evolve, the Queen reportedly turned her attention inward, towards something less visible, but far more powerful: control through structure. Not control in the emotional sense, but in the institutional sense, a way to ensure that no matter how personalities shifted, the crown itself would remain untouched, unshaken, and ultimately unchallenged. At the heart of this effort was the Queen's trust, often described not as a financial entity, but as a sacred safeguard. It was designed to hold more than assets. It held continuity. It held influence. And most importantly, it held the future. Insiders suggest that properties like Balmoral and Sandringham were never just estates. They were anchors in a much larger system, tied together through layers of legal protections that extended deep into the framework of royal governance. The duchies, Cornwall, and Lancaster were not simply sources of income, but strategic pillars, reinforcing a structure that ensured stability even when the family itself faced uncertainty. But what made this architecture truly formidable was its complexity. It wasn't built on a single document or decree. It was layered carefully, deliberately, through letters patent, trust provisions, and inheritance conditions that intersected in ways few could fully comprehend. Each layer served a purpose. Each clause carried weight. And together, they formed something almost impenetrable, a system that could adapt without appearing to change. Those who have studied these frameworks often describe them as living mechanisms, evolving quietly over time, always aligned with one guiding principle: duty above all else. That principle, duty over personal relationships, was not just a phrase, it was a doctrine, and it shaped every decision the Queen made in constructing this system. Relationships could shift, loyalties could waver, but the institution had to remain constant. It had to be protected, even if that meant placing limits on those closest to it. Reports suggest that this is where the most subtle, and perhaps most controversial, safeguards were introduced. Not overt restrictions, not public declarations, but quiet conditions clauses that could be activated only under specific circumstances, designed to prevent any one individual from exerting undue influence over the monarchy's core structures. And this is where the story begins to tighten, because early indications, long before the present moment, hinted that not all roles within this system were permanent. Some were conditional. Some were dependent on alignment, on conduct, on factors that were never openly discussed but always quietly monitored. It was a system built not on trust alone, but on verification. On the understanding that proximity to power required more than status, it required adherence to an unspoken code. As the years passed, these mechanisms remained largely invisible, operating in the background, untouched and unquestioned, until now. Because what Prince William and his advisors have reportedly uncovered is not a new development, but the activation of something old, something intentional. A safeguard that was never meant to draw attention, but to act when the moment demanded it. And buried within that architecture was a clause so precise, so targeted, that few even knew it existed until now. It wasn't bold. It wasn't obvious. But according to palace insiders, this single clause carried the weight of an entire legacy, quietly determining who could remain within the Queen's inner circle of trust, and who could be removed without warning. What made this clause so unsettling was not just its existence, but the way it was written: precise, restrained, almost invisible, unless you knew exactly where to look. Those familiar with the review process suggest it was never designed to alarm. It was designed to act, quietly, decisively, without spectacle. And once Prince William and his legal advisors began to interpret its meaning, the realization reportedly unfolded in stages, each more significant than the last. This was not a guideline. It was not a suggestion. It was a mechanism, one that could, under very specific conditions, alter the structure of influence within the monarchy without requiring approval, debate, or even acknowledgement. At its core, the clause was said to be conditional, not tied to a single event, but to a convergence of factors. Succession alignment, governance stability, questions of influence. None of these were defined in emotional terms, yet all carried enormous weight. Insiders whisper that the clause was constructed to respond to imbalance when the internal equilibrium of the crown risked shifting too far in one direction. And once triggered, its effect was immediate. There was no room for negotiation, no appeal. The language, according to those who have seen it, left little ambiguity. Roles could be reassessed, access could be restricted, participation within the trust could be quietly withdrawn. What stunned even seasoned advisors was the specificity. This was not a broad safeguard meant to cover all scenarios. It was targeted, focused, almost surgical in its intent. Reports suggest that during the internal discussions, several members of the advisory circle paused, not out of confusion, but out of recognition, because what they were seeing was not theoretical. It was actionable, and more importantly, it appeared to align with developments already unfolding within the royal structure. Timing, in this case, became impossible to ignore. The activation of this clause did not occur in isolation. It coincided with a period of heightened sensitivity within the monarchy, shifting responsibilities, evolving roles, and an increasing emphasis on future leadership. As these dynamics intensified, the clause, dormant for years, suddenly became relevant, and with that relevance came consequence. Because as interpretations solidified, one name began to surface more frequently in internal conversations: Queen Camilla. Her position, once considered secure within the broader framework of the trust, was now being re-evaluated through a different lens. Not publicly, not formally, but undeniably. Insiders suggest that the clause did not single her out directly, yet its application seemed to intersect with her role in ways that could not be dismissed. Questions of influence, questions of alignment, questions that, until now, had remained unspoken. And as those questions gained quiet momentum, the implications of the clause became increasingly clear. This was not about confrontation, it was about recalibration. A system adjusting itself according to rules set long ago, and in that adjustment, the balance of power began to shift subtly, but unmistakably. What had once been assumed stable was now uncertain. What had once been unquestioned was now under scrutiny. And all of it traced back to a single, carefully constructed provision that had waited patiently for the right moment to emerge. But if the clause was always there, the real question becomes, what triggered it now? In early 2026, something shifted inside the palace, and those closest to the process say it wasn't gradual. It was immediate, decisive, and quietly executed behind layers of protocol. The change did not arrive with noise or public declaration. It arrived with urgency, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. Reports suggest that a series of internal meetings began to take shape, each one more focused than the last, each one narrowing in on a single objective: interpretation. Not speculation, not discussion, but interpretation of a clause that had suddenly become active. And at the center of those early moments stood Prince William, reportedly the first to be fully briefed, the first to grasp the scale of what was unfolding. Those familiar with the situation claim that once he understood the implications, the process accelerated, quietly, but with unmistakable intent. From there, the circle widened, but only slightly. A select inner group was brought in, individuals known not for their rank, but for their precision: legal advisors, constitutional experts, trusted aides, each chosen not to debate the clause, but to define it. Because what they were dealing with was not a question of possibility. It was a question of execution. And as that realization settled in, the tempo inside the palace shifted dramatically. Conversations became shorter, decisions became faster. There was no room for delay. Legal teams, according to multiple accounts, began working in parallel, not collaboratively in the traditional sense, but in synchronized isolation, each tasked with confirming the same conclusion through different frameworks: trust law, constitutional precedent, internal governance rules. And as their findings aligned, a quiet consensus emerged. The clause was valid, its activation justified, and its consequences unavoidable. It was not open to reinterpretation. It was not subject to negotiation. It was, in every meaningful sense, already in motion. What followed was not a dramatic overhaul, but a series of controlled adjustments. Administrative changes, subtle but significant, began to appear within the structures tied to the trust. Access protocols were reviewed. Participation in certain decision-making channels was quietly reassessed. Documents were updated, not rewritten, reflecting a shift that had already been decided behind closed doors. To an outsider, nothing seemed different. But within the system, everything had changed. And then came the response. Reports suggest that representatives connected to Queen Camilla began seeking clarification, not confrontation, but understanding. Questions were raised, interpretations were requested, but the answers, according to those familiar with the exchanges, remained consistent. The clause had been triggered, its implications were being applied, and while the process was being handled with discretion, its direction was firm. What makes this moment so striking is not the conflict but the control. Insiders describe the atmosphere as controlled but tense, a space where every word carried weight, where every action was measured. There were no outbursts, no visible fractures. But beneath that calm surface, the reality was undeniable. The balance within the trust was shifting, and it was shifting quickly. The mechanisms set in place decades earlier were now fully engaged, operating exactly as intended, without hesitation, without reversal. And as this quiet transformation continued, one truth began to settle in, among those closest to it, that this was no longer about interpretation or possibility. It was about consequence. A system responding to its own design, moving forward with a precision that left little room for doubt. As the machinery of the monarchy began to move, the implications for Camilla were no longer theoretical, they were real. There was no announcement, no confrontation. But those watching closely say the shift was unmistakable. Camilla's role within the Queen's trust had been altered, and the silence surrounding it spoke louder than any statement. What made it so powerful, so quietly devastating, was how little needed to be said. According to those familiar with the inner workings of the palace, the change did not arrive in a single moment, but unfolded in a series of controlled adjustments. Invitations to certain discussions became less frequent. Access to key trust-related decisions, once routine, was gradually narrowed. Nothing dramatic. Nothing that could be pointed to as a definitive break. And yet, piece by piece, the structure around Queen Camilla began to shift in ways that were impossible to ignore for those paying attention. Insiders suggest that this was not accidental distancing. It was deliberate, calculated, and executed with precision. Where her presence had once been expected, it became optional. Where her voice had once carried influence, it was now received with restraint. The mechanisms of the trust continued to operate, but the channels through which she engaged with them were quietly being redefined. And perhaps most striking of all, this transformation occurred without disruption to the public image of unity. Official appearances remained composed, statements remained unchanged. But beneath that surface, the internal dynamics were evolving at a pace few had anticipated. Reports of diminished influence began to circulate in controlled whispers, not dramatic claims, not public accusations, but subtle acknowledgments from those close enough to observe the change. Decisions that once involved broader consultation were now handled within a tighter circle. Documentation moved through fewer hands. The system, once expansive, was becoming more contained. And within that containment, Camilla's role appeared to be shifting, not erased, but reduced in scope, redefined in purpose. The impact did not stop with her alone. Those connected to her extended circle, including members of the Parker Bowles family, reportedly began to feel the ripple effects. Invitations became more selective. Engagements tied to trust-related matters were quietly adjusted. It wasn't exclusion in the traditional sense, it was something more subtle, more refined. A recalibration, a quiet repositioning that signaled a change in alignment without ever declaring it outright. What makes this moment so emotionally charged is the contrast it presents. On one hand, the appearance of continuity, of stability, of unbroken tradition. On the other, a deeply personal shift unfolding behind closed doors. Insiders have described it not as a rebellion, not as a rejection, but as a recalibration. A system correcting itself according to rules that had long been in place. And within that correction, individuals, no matter how prominent, were subject to the same quiet forces. For the public, nothing seemed different. The monarchy continued its duties, its ceremonies, its carefully maintained image. But internally, the atmosphere had changed. Conversations were more measured. interactions more deliberate. The understanding had settled in that something significant had occurred, even if it could not be openly acknowledged. And in that silence, the weight of the shift became even more profound, because this was never about spectacle, it was about structure, about a system responding to its own design, reshaping itself in ways that prioritized continuity over comfort. And as that reshaping continued, one truth became increasingly clear. This was only part of a larger movement, one guided by a vision that extended far beyond any single individual. Yet behind this quiet shift stood a figure determined to see the Queen's vision through, no matter the personal cost. For William, this wasn't about emotion, it was about obligation. According to those familiar with the process, his actions were measured, deliberate, and rooted in a single principle: the preservation of the crown, above all else. What sets this moment apart is not just the decision itself, but the mindset behind it. Because insiders suggest that Prince William did not approach the situation as a son, a stepson, or even as a public figure navigating personal relationships. He approached it as an executor of a system, one that had been carefully constructed long before he was ever expected to wield its authority. And in that role, emotion had no place. There were no shortcuts, no reinterpretations to soften the outcome. Only the framework, only the rules. From the very beginning of this unfolding process, William is said to have aligned himself with a small, highly trusted circle within the royal structure. Not a broad coalition, not a political maneuver, but a precise collaboration with individuals who understood the weight of what they were dealing with. Legal advisors who had spent years studying royal frameworks, senior aides who had operated quietly within the institution's inner mechanisms, figures whose loyalty was not to individuals, but to continuity. Together, they did not seek to challenge the clause, they sought to confirm it, to ensure that every step taken was anchored in legality and precedent. And that distinction mattered. Because in a moment where personal interpretation could have introduced hesitation, William reportedly chose clarity instead. Sources close to the process suggest that once the clause was fully understood, he viewed it as non-negotiable. Not because of its impact, but because of its origin. This was not a new directive. It was part of a long-term framework established under Queen Elizabeth II, a system designed to function precisely in moments like this. To ignore it would not have been an act of compassion. It would have been a breach of duty. That sense of duty shaped every decision that followed. There were no public statements, no visible shifts in tone from William himself. Strategic silence became a tool, not a retreat. By maintaining composure, by avoiding escalation, he allowed the process to unfold without external pressure. And in doing so, he reinforced a message that insiders say has long defined the monarchy at its core. The institution does not bend to individual circumstance, it endures. This is where the contrast becomes most striking. On one side, the personal implications, relationships, perceptions, expectations. On the other, the institutional imperative structure, continuity, legacy. William, according to those observing closely, chose the latter without hesitation. Not because it was easier, but because it was necessary. Because the framework he was operating within demanded consistency, even when that consistency carried difficult consequences. And as the process continued, that consistency began to reshape the internal balance of the trust in ways that could not be undone. The clause was not just being acknowledged, it was being executed. Quietly, precisely, and without deviation. The message was clear. This was not about confrontation. It was about alignment with a system that had already defined its own path forward. But even within such calculated precision, consequences are never contained. They extend outward, touching not just the immediate structures, but the relationships, perceptions, and expectations that surround them. And as this particular decision continued to take effect, its impact began to move beyond the confines of internal governance, carrying with it a ripple that would be felt far more widely than anyone had initially anticipated. But even the most calculated moves have consequences, and this one would ripple far beyond palace walls. Inside the palace, the aftermath wasn't explosive, it was colder than that. Conversations shifted, alliances recalibrated, and the quiet reality settled in. The balance of power had changed. What made this phase so tense was not open disagreement, but controlled distance. According to those familiar with the internal atmosphere, a subtle divide began to take shape, one not defined by conflict, but by perspective. On one side stood the traditionalists, figures deeply aligned with the long-standing principles of the monarchy, those who viewed the clause's activation as not only justified, but necessary. On the other side were the loyalists, individuals whose alignment was shaped more by personal ties than institutional doctrine. The divide was not loud, but it was unmistakable, and in the spaces between those positions, uncertainty began to grow. At the center of this delicate shift stood King Charles III, reportedly navigating one of the most complex positions of his reign. Insiders suggest that his role was not to initiate or overturn the process, but to absorb its consequences to maintain continuity while managing the emotional and relational weight it carried. It was, by all accounts, a balancing act. On one side, the framework established under Queen Elizabeth II. On the other, the individuals directly affected by its activation. And between them, a monarch expected to hold the line without fracturing the institution he represents. Publicly, nothing appeared out of place. Appearances continued. Engagements were carried out with the same composure, the same carefully maintained unity that has long defined the royal image. But insiders suggest that behind that composure, efforts were being made to preserve cohesion. Conversations were carefully managed. Messaging was tightly controlled. The priority was clear. Whatever shifts were occurring internally, they would not be allowed to disrupt the outward stability of the crown. Staff, according to multiple accounts, were given clear instructions: avoid speculation, avoid discussion, and above all, avoid leaks. Yet despite those efforts, fragments of the story began to surface. Not as full disclosures, but as hints, subtle observations, questions raised in media circles. Journalists known for their proximity to royal affairs began to reference internal recalibrations and structural adjustments. Language that suggested something significant was unfolding beneath the surface. The narrative was not yet complete, but it was beginning to take shape. Within the trust itself, the shift became more defined. The clause was no longer just a point of discussion. It had become the foundation for a new interpretation of how the structure would operate moving forward. Stricter boundaries, more controlled participation, a tighter alignment with the original framework. It was not a reinvention, but a refinement, one that reinforced the principles the trust was built upon, even as it altered the roles within it. And as this new structure began to settle into place, the implications extended beyond the immediate moment. Because what had been activated was not temporary. It was not a reaction. It was a return to a system designed to function under pressure, to recalibrate when necessary, and to prioritize continuity above all else. Those within the palace understood this. They recognized that what had occurred was not an isolated adjustment, but part of a larger pattern, one that would continue to shape the institution in ways still unfolding. The tension, therefore, was not just about what had changed, but about what it meant moving forward, about how relationships would adapt, how roles would evolve, and how the monarchy would carry this shift into its next chapter. And as those questions lingered, one realization began to take hold among those closest to the situation, that the true impact of this moment was only just beginning to be understood. And as the dust begins to settle, one truth is becoming impossible to ignore. In the end, this was never just about Camilla. It was about something far greater, a system designed to endure beyond personalities, beyond controversy, and beyond even the crown itself. What this entire sequence has revealed, according to those who have followed it closely, is the quiet strength of a design set in motion long ago by Queen Elizabeth II, a system not built for comfort, but for continuity. The safeguards she embedded were never meant to be visible. They were meant to function. And now, in a moment that few could have predicted with such precision, those safeguards have done exactly what they were intended to do. They have held, they have responded. And in doing so, they have reaffirmed a principle that sits at the very core of the monarchy itself. that it is not shaped by individuals, but by the structures that outlast them. This is where the idea of the monarchy as a sacred trust becomes more than symbolism. It becomes reality. A framework that does not bend easily, that does not shift according to personal relationships or emotional currents. It endures. And within that endurance, difficult decisions are not avoided. They are absorbed, quietly, decisively, without spectacle. What has unfolded within the trust is not a rupture, but a demonstration of resilience, a system recalibrating itself to remain aligned with its original purpose. At the center of this recalibration stands Prince William, emerging not through declaration, but through action. His role in this moment has not been defined by visibility, but by execution. Reports suggest that his approach, measured, controlled, unwavering, has reinforced his position as a future king, shaped not by circumstance, but by responsibility. He did not create the framework. He did not alter its course. He followed it. And in doing so, he signaled a continuity that extends beyond the present moment into the future of the institution itself. For Queen Camilla, the outcome is more complex, more nuanced. Her role has not disappeared, but it has been redefined, permanently shaped by the activation of a system that does not operate on sentiment. Insiders suggest that this shift is not about removal, but about repositioning within a structure that prioritizes alignment above all else. It is a reminder that within the monarchy, proximity to power is never absolute. It is conditional. And those conditions, once triggered, are not easily reversed. What makes this moment so powerful is the contrast it reveals. On one side, personal history, relationships, and expectations. On the other, a system that moves forward regardless of them. The institution, in this case, has chosen continuity over comfort, structure over sentiment. And while that choice carries weight, emotional, personal, undeniable, it also reinforces the very foundation upon which the monarchy stands. Because this was never just about a clause. It was about what that clause represents. A commitment to something larger than any individual. A framework designed to endure pressure, to adapt without collapsing, to protect the legacy entrusted to it. And as this chapter draws closer to its quiet conclusion, one truth becomes increasingly clear. The monarchy has not been weakened by this moment. It has been tested, and it has held. Because in the House of Windsor, loyalty may shape the present, but legacy decides who remains written into the future. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.